I used to think the worst thing that could happen to a person was losing someone they loved. I was wrong. The worst thing is discovering that the person you spent years hating was quietly, invisibly keeping you alive and never once asking you to know about it. My name is Lolita Meyer, and this is the story of how I almost died, how I was saved, and how the truth of who saved me broke something open inside me that I am still, even now, trying to understand. I need to tell you this carefully, because if I rush it, you won't feel it the way I felt it. And if you don't feel it, then I failed the only thing I've been trying to do since the night I found out the truth, which is to make sure that what Rowena Velez did for me does not go quietly into the world without anyone knowing what kind of person he really is. Let me start at the beginning. Not the hospital beginning, the real beginning. The beginning that matters. Rowena and I met when we were 19. We were both freshman students at Caldwell University, both enrolled in the same competitive journalism program, both determined to be the best in the room. The program only kept the top 15 students after the first semester. There were 32 of us at the start. I remember the first day of orientation. The professor, Dr. Halcourt, told us to look around the room. He said, "Half of you will not be here by February. The ones who remain will have earned their place. This is not a program for people who need encouragement. This is a program for people who can handle the truth." I remember thinking that was unnecessarily theatrical. Then Rowena Velez walked in late. He was not particularly remarkable to look at. Medium height, dark hair that was slightly too long for formal settings, wearing a gray jacket that looked like it had seen better days. He sat down in the seat directly beside me, the only one left, and he didn't apologize to the professor. He just opened his notebook and started writing, as if he'd been there the whole time. "You're late," I whispered. He looked at me sideways. "I know." "That's it? Just I know? Was there something else you wanted me to say?" I remember thinking he was arrogant. I wasn't entirely wrong, but here's the thing about arrogance. And I've had years to think about this. Sometimes what looks like arrogance is actually just a person who has decided they don't owe you a performance of humility. They don't feel. I didn't understand that at 19. At 19, I just thought he was insufferable. The competition between us started almost immediately, and it was not manufactured. It was real. We were genuinely equally matched, which is the most infuriating kind of rivalry because you can never fully dismiss the other person. Every time I thought I had pulled ahead, Rowena was there. Every time he led, I closed the gap. By October, Dr. Halcord had started calling us the problem. Not unkindly, but with a kind of exhausted amusement, the way a teacher looks at two students who are both right about something they're arguing about. The first serious incident happened during a group project on investigative ethics. We had been assigned to work together, which neither of us wanted. We were supposed to co-author a piece on source protection. I had drafted the opening framework. Rolina rewrote half of it without telling me. Not because it was bad, he told me later, matter-of-factly, but because his approach was more defensible. I didn't speak to him for a week after that. The professor gave us the highest mark in the class. I was furious about that too. By the end of the first semester, 6 people had dropped out, 4 had transferred, and 12 remained. Rolena and I were both among them. Dr. Halcord looked at both of us during the final review and said, with what I can only describe as deeply personal amusement, "Of course, that was when the dynamic calcified into something harder. Not just competition anymore, something with sharper edges. Something that felt, when I was being honest with myself in the small hours of the night, uncomfortably personal. I didn't examine that feeling too closely. I was 19. I was focused on my future. I told myself it was professional rivalry and left it at that. The years moved fast, the way they do when you are constantly in motion. By our second year, Rowena and I had developed a specific kind of Cold War, polished, functional, and relentless. We competed for every internship, every byline opportunity, every commendation from faculty. We both got the summer internship at the city paper junior year. We were assigned to the same desk. Our supervisor, a tired and brilliant woman named Margot Chen, took one look at our dynamic and separated us to opposite ends of the bullpen without a word of explanation. We were cordial in professional settings. We were never warm. There was always a quality to our interactions that felt like a held breath. Like both of us were waiting for the other to do something unforgivable, and we had agreed without ever discussing it, to give each other every opportunity to do so. I won't pretend I was innocent. I wasn't. There was a story in our third year, an investigative piece about the city's housing authority. I had been working on it for 3 months. Rowena had been working on a parallel story from a different angle, and we both knew it. Our professor suggested we collaborate to produce something stronger. I refused. I published mine first. It was good. It was not as comprehensive as it could have been if we had worked together. But it was mine, and I published it first. And at 21, that felt like winning. Rolena's piece came out 2 weeks later. It was better. He never said anything about it. He didn't need to. The work spoke clearly enough. I think about that a lot now, the version of myself that chose competition over collaboration over and over again, because being right mattered more to me than being fair. I was not a bad person. I want to be clear about that. But I was a person who had decided, very early on, that Rowena Velez was my adversary, and I treated every interaction with him through that lens. Every kindness he showed me got filtered through suspicion. Every distance he kept got interpreted as contempt. There was one night, junior year, mid-February, the kind of cold that seeps through windows even when they're closed. I had been at the library until 2 in the morning working on a deadline piece. When I came out, my bicycle, which I had locked to the rack outside the east entrance, had a flat tire. Not just flat. The valve had been snapped off. It was going to be a long walk home in the cold. Roina was leaving at the same time. He saw me standing there looking at the tire. He didn't say anything. He just stood there for a moment, and then he said, "I can walk with you if you want." I said no. I said I was fine. He nodded and left. I stood in the cold for a moment after he was gone, and I felt something strange. Something that felt like regret, but at the time I told myself was just the cold getting to me. I walked home alone. It took 40 minutes. I have thought about that night many times since. The way he offered without making it an offering. No performance of generosity, no waiting for gratitude. Just, if you want. And when I said no, he accepted it without argument, without hurt feelings, without using it against me later. I didn't know how to read that kind of quiet decency at 21. I had decided who he was, and I couldn't make his behavior fit the narrative. We graduated in the same cohort. We both got jobs, me at a mid-sized digital news outlet, Rowena at a different one. We moved in different professional circles for a while, and honestly, I felt relieved. The constant, low-grade tension of his presence had become something I'd grown so accustomed to that I hadn't noticed how much energy it was consuming until it was gone. I told myself I didn't think about him. It was not entirely true. Occasionally, his bylines would cross my feed. He was good. I would read his pieces. In that careful, analytical way you read work by someone you can't afford to dismiss, cataloging what he did well, and what I thought he could have done better, the way you annotate a text you're studying. I told myself this was professional curiosity. I told myself it wasn't personal. At 25, I was diagnosed with stage 2 kidney disease, not the kind that kills you immediately, the kind that sits at the edge of your life and slowly reshapes everything around it, the kind that means you have good months and hard months, and in the hard months you learn things about yourself that you would have preferred not to know. The diagnosis arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the small office with a plant that needed watering. My doctor, Fernandez, a calm and precise man who I grew to trust enormously over the years, sat across from me and explained what this meant in language that was clear without being brutal. There were options. There were timelines. There was monitoring. There was medication. There was a possible future further down the road where a transplant would become necessary. But that was not today's conversation. I remember walking out of that office into bright and different afternoon sunlight and standing on the sidewalk for what felt like a very long time and thinking, I'm 25 years old and my body has decided to become a problem. I did not tell many people. My mother, who cried in the specific way mothers cry when they are trying not to let you see them cry. My closest friend, Dahlia, who immediately started researching everything she could find and sent me 47 texts over the next 2 days. And my editor, because I needed to adjust some deadlines. I did not tell Rowena. We had not spoken in over a year. There was no reason to tell Rowena. Life continued the way it does. I managed the disease with discipline. The medication, the diet, the monitoring, the quarterly visits with Dr. Fernandez that became the metronome of my life. I was functional. I was working. I was producing good work, actually, some of the best writing I had done. because illness has a way of clarifying what matters, of stripping away the trivial concerns and leaving only the things that are actually real. And then, at 28, things got worse. The progression was faster than Dr. Fernandez had hoped. By March of that year, he was using words like accelerated and sooner than anticipated. By June, he was talking about the transplant list. By September, I was on it. The transplant list. I remember reading about what that means. The median wait time, the compatibility requirements, the logistics of a life spent in proximity to a hospital, the way you have to carry your phone at all times, because the call could come at any moment, or might not come for years. I remember reading all of this in the clinical, organized way I processed information. And then I remember closing my laptop and sitting in my apartment in the dark for a very long time. I was 28 years old and I was waiting for someone else's kidney to keep me alive. Or waiting for a living donor. Someone who would voluntarily give up a part of themselves for me. The people in my life were kind. My mother offered immediately and without hesitation, the kind of offer that made me love her so fiercely it was almost painful. She wasn't a match. Dahlia offered next. Also not a match. 2 other friends, close ones, tested. Neither was compatible. My father was gone, had been gone since I was 11. So that door didn't exist. The months started to blur. I kept working. I kept living, but there was a quality to the waiting that I cannot fully describe. A kind of suspended state, like a note held just past the point where it should naturally resolve. You're still present. You're still yourself, but there's a part of you that has detached slightly from the ordinary current of life, because ordinary life requires a kind of investment in the future that feels strange when the future is something you're waiting for someone else to give you. I kept working. I wrote some pieces I'm genuinely proud of. I called my mother every Sunday. I went to my appointments. I took my medication. I waited. That was the year I ran into Rowena. Not metaphorically, literally ran into him. I was coming out of a coffee shop on Meridian Street, not paying attention, and I walked directly into someone coming in. My coffee went on his jacket. His coffee went on the floor. We both stepped back, and we both started to apologize, and then we both stopped. Pause. It had been almost 3 years since we had been in the same room. He looked different, or maybe not different. Maybe I was seeing him differently, through 9 years of accumulated history, and the particular clarity that illness gives you. His hair was shorter. There was a tiredness around his eyes that I didn't remember, and something else, a kind of steadiness, a settled quality, like a person who had found their center and planted themselves there. Lolita, he said. Rolina. I looked at the coffee spreading across the floor between us. I'm sorry about your jacket. It's fine. He looked at me, and there was something in the way he looked at me, careful, searching, like he was checking something. That was different from how he used to look at me. The competition, the measuring, the constant quiet evaluation. That was still there, but underneath it was something I couldn't name. Something that felt almost like concern. You look tired, he said. I'm fine, I said. The automatic answer, the one I gave everyone. He held my gaze for a moment. He didn't push it. He never did, I was realizing. He never pushed past the wall I put up. He just stood at the edge of it and looked. We exchanged numbers, both of us slightly surprised to find ourselves doing it. He said something about coffee rescheduled, a vague social nicety, and I nodded. We went our separate ways. I thought about that encounter for the rest of the day. Not the collision. The way he looked at me. The "you look tired," which was not an insult the way he said it, but something quieter, something that felt almost like seeing. I had spent 9 years building Rowena Velez into an adversary. Standing on Meridian Street with coffee on my shoes and the November cold in my lungs, I had the strange, disorienting feeling that I had been looking at a blurry image for a very long time, and something had just snapped it into focus. He texted 3 days later, not to reschedule coffee. He had read one of my recent pieces, a long-form investigation into emergency shelter wait times, and he said, simply, "This is your best work. The structural argument in the 3rd section is flawless." I stared at the message for a long time. In 9 years of rivalry, Rowena had never once complimented my work to my face, or to my phone, or in any direct, personal way that couldn't be explained away as competitive analysis. I typed and deleted 4 different responses. I finally sent, "Thank you. The sourcing on your piece last month on the Transit Authority was exceptional." He replied, "I noticed you didn't mention the conclusion." I replied, "The conclusion was weak." He replied, "I know." And somehow that was the beginning. That small, specific, honest exchange about the conclusion being weak. That was the crack in 9 years of wall. We started texting occasionally. Not constantly, we were both busy, both private people, but occasionally. He would send a thought about something he was working on. I would reply with an observation. I would share something I was struggling with on a piece, and he would offer a perspective that was almost always useful, offered without ego, without agenda. I didn't tell him about the kidney disease. Not yet. It felt like a risk I wasn't ready to take. Not because I thought he would use it against me, but because, and I am still working out how to articulate this, there was a part of me that was afraid that if he knew how fragile I was, the new fragile equilibrium between us would shift in some way I couldn't predict. That he would become careful with me. That the honesty between us, which was the only thing I had ever trusted about our dynamic, would be replaced by something gentler and less true. That fear tells you something about how I saw him, something important that I was not yet ready to admit to myself. Christmas that year was quiet. I spent it with my mother, who made too much food and watched me eat with the specific scrutiny of a woman who has been frightened for her child and does not know what to do with that fear except cook. I watched her watching me, and I felt the weight of what I was putting her through. The waiting, the uncertainty, the way the shadow of it fell over every ordinary moment. New Year's, I was alone in my apartment. I had been invited to 3 different gatherings and declined all of them. I sat by the window with a cup of tea and watched the city count down through fireworks. I could see, but not quite hear, and I thought about the year that was ending and the year ahead and what it might or might not contain. At 11:58, Rowena texted, "I hope next year is kinder to you than this one." I held the phone for a moment. The clock ticked past midnight. The fireworks bloomed and faded outside my window. I typed back, "How did you know this year wasn't kind?" His response came after a pause, longer than his usual replies. "I didn't. I just hoped." I don't know exactly when I started to understand that what I felt for Rowena Velez was not hatred, had perhaps never been hatred, had been something much more complicated that I had spent a decade mislabeling, because hatred was simpler and safer and required nothing from me. Love, the possibility of love, the shape of it moving underneath the hostility like something alive under frozen water. Love required everything. Love required me to look at 9 years of choices and understand what they had actually been about. I wasn't ready to call it love. Not yet, but at 12:01 on New Year's morning, sitting alone in my apartment with my tea growing cold and the city quieting outside my window, I typed back, "I hope the same for you," and I meant it in a way that surprised me. January was when my health declined seriously. The word my doctor used was acute. That word, so small and clinical, covering so much. Acute decline. Acute need. Acute urgency. He sat across from me in that same small office. The plant had been replaced, I noticed, with a succulent that seemed to be doing better. And he told me that we were looking at a shorter timeline than we had hoped, that the dialysis, which I had been managing for 4 months, was becoming less effective, that my position on the transplant list would be prioritized, but prioritization was still not certainty. I called my mother. She cried. I held it together until after the call, and then I sat on my bathroom floor for a while and let myself feel it. The fear, the anger, the profound exhaustion of being brave about something for 3 years and suddenly running out of bravery. I did not call Rowena. We were still in that tender, new, fragile place. Not friends exactly, but no longer enemies. Something undefined and tentative. I did not know how to bring this into that space. I did not know what I wanted from him. I was afraid of wanting anything from him. But he called me. Not that day. The following week, he said he was in my neighborhood and had coffee, and he asked if I wanted company. Just like that, no explanation, no performance of concern. Just, "I have coffee, do you want company?" I said yes. It came up. He sat at my kitchen table, which was covered in medical paperwork I hadn't had the energy to file. And he put the coffee down, and he didn't say anything about the paperwork. He talked about a piece he was working on. He asked me about mine. We sat in my kitchen for 2 hours and talked about work and about a film we had both seen and about a restaurant that had recently closed that we had both apparently liked for different reasons. He didn't push. He didn't pry. He just sat there in my kitchen, in my difficult life, like he had always been there. When he left, he said he'd come by again if I wanted. I said I wanted. Pause. Something in my chest shifted when I said that. Something that had been locked moved. I told him 3 weeks later. We were walking. He had started coming by on Sunday afternoons, and somewhere in those weeks it had become a routine, something I was organizing my Sundays around. And we were walking along the river path, the February cold, sharp, and clean, and I just said it, not planned, not prepared. It came out of me the way true things sometimes do when you've been carrying them long enough that they stop being something you hold and start being something that holds you. I have kidney disease, I said. I'm on the transplant list. He didn't stop walking. He didn't gasp or reach for me or offer the battery of anxious responses I had been dreading. He walked beside me for a moment, and then he said quietly, I know. I stopped. What do you mean you know? He stopped too. He looked at me. Dahlia, he said. She told me 3 months ago. 3 months ago. He had known for 3 months. He had texted me about my writing and brought coffee to my apartment, had sat at my kitchen table and talked about films and restaurants, had started spending his Sunday afternoons walking along the river with me, and he had known. Why didn't you say anything? I asked. He thought about it the way he thought about things, carefully, without rushing, as if words mattered enough to choose well. Because you hadn't told me, he said, and I figured when you wanted me to know, you'd tell me. I looked at him for a long moment. Aren't you going to say something about it? I asked. Something helpful, some research, some questions. Do you want that? He asked. Or do you want someone to just walk with you? I didn't answer right away. The river moved beside us, dark and unhurried, and the trees were bare against the white sky, and the cold was the kind that makes the world feel very still. Both, I finally said. He nodded. Okay, he said, and we kept walking. February became March. March became April. Rowena was a consistent presence in a way I had not expected and could not quite explain, not overwhelming. He was not the kind of person who overwhelmed, but reliable. The way a good structure is reliable. The kind you don't notice until you imagine the building without it. He drove me to dialysis 3 times when the transport was unreliable. He never made a production of it. He would simply be there waiting in the car with a coffee that was exactly the way I took it. I had never told him how I took my coffee, which means he had noticed, which means he had been paying attention to me for longer and more carefully than I had understood. He would sometimes be in my apartment when I came home from a session. I had given him a key, which I still find remarkable when I think about it now. The casualness with which I handed him that key, like some part of me had already decided to trust him, and was simply waiting for the rest of me to catch up. He would have made food, nothing elaborate, just something practical and warm. He would be reading on my sofa, and he'd look up when I came in and say something about whatever he was reading, and we would fall into conversation. And I would sit there wrapped in a blanket eating something I hadn't had the energy to make for myself, and I would think, this is the most natural thing in the world. And then immediately after that, I would think, what is this? What are we? What am I doing? Because I knew what I felt. By April, it was impossible not to know. It had been impossible for months, if I was honest, and I was slowly getting better at honesty, at least with myself. I was in love with Rowena Velez. I was in love with my sworn enemy, the person I had spent a decade dismissing and competing with and misunderstanding. The person who had apparently been paying attention to how I took my coffee while I was too busy cataloging his professional shortcomings to notice. The irony of it is not lost on me. But here's the thing about loving someone when you are scared. And I was scared not just of the feeling, but of everything. Of my body and the future and the transplant list and the relentless uncertainty of all of it. Here's the thing. Fear has a way of making cowards of brave people. I had faced 9 years of professional competition without flinching. I had faced a medical diagnosis that would have undone many people, but the thought of telling Rowena that I loved him made me feel more genuinely terrified than almost anything I had experienced. Because what if I was wrong about what he felt? What if the coffee and the key and the Sunday walks and the dialysis rides were simply kindness? What if he was just a good person, a better person than I had given him credit for, and I had mistaken that goodness for something more? What if I told him and lost the only steady thing in my unsteady life? I said nothing. May came, and with it a call from Dr. Fernandez that I had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. There was a donor. Anonymous. Living donor. Someone had come forward. Someone who had been tested and matched and approved. The compatibility was exceptional. The surgery was scheduled for the 17th. Goss booze. I sat in my car in the parking garage of the hospital where I'd taken the call, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried in years. Ugly ragged, the kind of crying that is not grief, but its opposite. The release of 3 years of held breath. Someone had come forward. Someone was willing to give me part of themselves. A stranger, someone I would never know, because the donor had specifically and unambiguously requested complete anonymity, not just the usual protective anonymity, something more absolute. Something the hospital coordinator described with a particular, careful emphasis that I noticed but didn't examine closely. I called my mother. I called Dahlia. I called Rowena last, which tells you something about where he sat in my life by then. He was quiet for a moment when I told him. Then he said, "I'm glad." And the way he said it, so carefully, so specifically, carrying more weight than 2 syllables should hold, I noticed it. But I was too overwhelmed with relief and anticipation to sit with the noticing. "Will you come?" I asked. "I'll be there," he said. Surgery day. I remember the fluorescence of the preoperative room. Cold and particular. I remember the nurse who made a small joke about my name being unusual and seemed genuinely interested when I explained its origin. I remember the anesthesiologist, brisk and efficient. I remember looking at the ceiling and thinking about the strange geometry of a life, the decade of competition, and the months of unexpected tenderness and all the words I hadn't said, and the anonymous person in another room somewhere in this same building who was giving up a piece of themselves for me right now, and the way gratitude can feel almost too large to live inside your body. I remember Rowena's face in the waiting area as they wheeled me past. He was sitting in the chair nearest the corridor, not reading, not on his phone, just sitting. He looked up when he saw me. We looked at each other for the few seconds the transport allowed. "I'll be here," he said. He was. Recovery is a particular kind of time, slow and interior. The body doing its work in the dark, knitting itself back together, making new arrangements. Pain that is proof of progress. Sleep that is deep and dreamless and necessary. Rowena visited every day, not for long. He was careful about my rest, would stay an hour, sometimes 2, would bring things I needed or wanted without asking what they were. He had developed, over these months, a specific fluency in what I needed. It was not magic. It was attention. He had simply been paying attention to me for longer and more carefully than I had understood. Dahlia visited too, and she would sometimes overlap with Rowena, and the 3 of us would sit in my hospital room and talk about small, ordinary things with the particular relief of people who have been afraid and are now, for the moment, less afraid. But here is what I remember most from those recovery weeks. Not the pain, not the medication schedule, not the small victories of walking a few more steps each day. What I remember is one afternoon in the 3rd week, when Rowena was sitting in the chair beside my bed reading, not performing presence. And I watched him without his knowing for a while, the angle of his head, the way his hand moved when he turned a page, the familiar shape of a person I had known for a decade and had finally, stopped being afraid of knowing. "Rowena," I said. He looked up. "Thank you," I said, "for all of it. These months. I haven't said it clearly enough." He looked at me, that careful, measured look. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I want to." He was quiet. "Lolita," he said, and something in the way he said my name, something in the weight of it, the particular care with which he formed it, made my chest tighten. Just get well. That's all I need. That's all I need. I turned that phrase over in my mind for days afterward. The way you turn a stone to see what's underneath. I was discharged after 5 weeks. I came home to my apartment, which Rowena had quietly cleaned and stocked before my arrival. Though he acted as if this were unremarkable when I mentioned it, I began the slow process of rebuilding. Physical therapy, diet adjustments, medication, rest, the gradual reclamation of ordinary life. Rowena was there. He had reorganized his schedule in ways I was only partially aware of. Later, I would find out the extent of it, but at the time I only saw the effect. That he was frequently available, frequently present, without ever making his availability feel like sacrifice. I began to wonder, seriously and persistently, about the donor. It's a strange thing having a piece of someone inside you that you cannot name or thank or look at across a room. The hospital had been clear. The donor had requested complete anonymity, an unusual degree of it, and the request would be honored. There was nothing I could do. There was no pathway to knowing. But I wondered what kind of person does this? Gives a part of themselves, a kidney, not a small thing, not an easy thing, and asks for nothing in return, not gratitude, not acknowledgement, not even the knowledge that the recipient knows who saved them. I thought about this often during recovery. I built a person in my mind, generous, private, motivated by something I couldn't quite see. I felt an enormous, inarticulate tenderness toward this unknown person, a gratitude that had nowhere to land and so kept circling. In June, about a month after I came home, Dahlia came over for dinner. We were in the kitchen. She was cooking. I was sitting at the table, which I was still not allowed to stand at for long, and we were talking about the donor, which was a conversation I kept returning to the way you return to something that doesn't yet make sense. Do you have any guesses? I asked her. Any instinct? Dahlia was very still for a moment. She was stirring something on the stove. She did not look at me. No, she said, after a pause that was just a fraction too long. I noticed the pause. I filed it. July. I was feeling better. Genuinely better. In a way that was still new enough to be remarkable. The absence of constant low-grade misery, a kind of daily miracle. I had gone back to work part-time. I was walking again. The long Sunday walks that had become the architecture of something I could not yet name. Rowena was walking beside me the way he had been for months now. And I almost said it. I almost said, I love you. We were at the bend in the river path where the trees lean over the water, and in summer, the light comes through them in a particular way that makes everything look slightly dreamed. I almost said it. I didn't. I was afraid. Still afraid. And there was something else. A feeling I couldn't articulate. A sense that there was something I didn't yet know. Something that mattered. Something that was moving underneath the surface of everything. I turned it over that night, trying to understand what I was sensing. The thing that broke the story open was not dramatic. It was small. It was a Tuesday afternoon in August, and I had a follow-up appointment at the transplant center, a routine post-operative check, compatibility, and function monitoring. I arrived a few minutes early and sat in the waiting area. The coordinator who had managed my case, a kind, efficient woman named Sandra, came out to greet me, and as she did, the door to the hallway behind her opened, and a man came through it. He was moving quickly and didn't see me, and then he did see me, and he stopped. Rowena stopped. He was wearing the kind of casual clothes you wear to a medical appointment, not work clothes, and there was a moment, a single, suspended moment, where we looked at each other across that waiting room, and something in his face moved in a way that I did not have context for yet. Something that was not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that looked almost like fear, and he collected himself immediately the way he always collected himself, but not before I had seen it. Rolina, I said, what are you doing here? Follow up, he said, smoothly. Normally. Kidney function monitoring. It's routine. I stared at him. Something was happening inside my chest that I did not have words for yet, something assembling itself from fragments. The pause in Dahlia's voice when I asked about the donor. The particular weight in his voice when he said, that's all I need. The extraordinary degree of anonymity the donor had requested. The way he had been there, so consistently and so completely, without ever making it about himself. Rowena, I said. Lolita, is it you? My voice came out smaller than I intended. Was it you? Long pause. He looked at me for a long moment. I don't know what. Don't. My voice broke slightly. Don't protect me right now. I need to know. Was it you? He looked away, toward the window. The August sunlight was bright and indifferent. His jaw was tight. And then, very quietly, without looking at me, he said, yes. Long pause. I don't know how long we stood there. I know that Sandra had quietly retreated. I know that the waiting room was empty. I know that the light was doing something specific with the dust in the air, and that I could hear my own heartbeat and the sound of traffic outside and nothing else. Rowena had given me a kidney, Rowena Velez. My sworn enemy, my decade-long adversary, the person I had spent years competing with and resenting and misunderstanding. had been tested, had come forward as a living donor, and had given me part of himself, and had asked for nothing, not even for me to know. I could not speak. Why? I finally said. It wasn't even a full question, just the word. He turned to look at me, and there was something in his face that I had never seen there before. Not the composed, measured, careful Rowena I had known for a decade, but something beneath that, something raw and real and exhausted with being hidden. Because you were going to die, he said, and I couldn't. He stopped. You couldn't what? He looked at me. Directly, fully, without the careful management I was used to. I couldn't let that happen, he said, and there was something I could do about it, so I did. That's not. My voice was unsteady. That's not a complete answer. No, he said. It's not. The silence between us was the most significant silence I had ever stood in. I've been trying to figure out what to do about you, he said, since the first semester of freshman year. I have been trying to figure out what you are to me and what I was to you, and whether any of it mattered, for a decade, and I. He stopped again. He looked at the window. I chose the way I chose. I thought if you ever found out it was me, I didn't want it to. He exhaled. I didn't want you to feel like you owed me something. I didn't do it for that. Then why did you do it? He looked back at me, and he said, very quietly and very clearly, because I love you, because I have loved you for a very long time, and I have not known what to do with that. And the only thing I knew how to do, the only thing I knew was true, was this. I stood in that waiting room in August sunlight, and I felt the full weight of 9 years of history reorganizing itself around a truth I had been too afraid to see, and my chest was doing something I had no clinical language for, something that was grief and relief and love and devastation, all moving through the same space at the same time. I want to tell you, I said something beautiful, something equal to the moment. I did not. I walked out. I know how that sounds. But here's what you have to understand, and I am not asking you to excuse it, only to understand it. There are moments where the truth arrives so much larger than you were prepared for, that you cannot process it in place. You need to move. You need air. You need the distance between yourself and the source of the feeling. I walked out into the August afternoon, and I kept walking. I walked until I was at the river path, our river path, the path that had become ours over these months without my fully acknowledging that it had. And I sat on a bench, and I watched the water, and I let it hit me. All of it. He had known when he was being tested for compatibility that I might find out. He had done it anyway. He had given up a kidney, not an abstract sacrifice, but a concrete, physical, permanent one, and had asked for nothing. Not even for me to know his name, and I thought about every moment of our 10 years together through this new lens, and the reorganization was profound and terrible and beautiful all at once. Every competition, and had any of it ever really been competition, or had it been two people circling something neither of them knew how to name? Every time he hadn't pushed past the wall I put up. Every coffee, every key, every Sunday walk, every "you look tired, you don't have to thank me, that's all I need." I sat on that bench for a long time. I thought about the version of myself that had refused to let him walk me home in the February cold 9 years ago. The version that had published first one small, chosen competition over connection over and over again because connection was frightening and competition was safe. I had been so afraid of what he meant to me that I had spent a decade converting it into something I could manage. And he had spent a decade, patient, steady, paying attention to how I took my coffee, waiting. And then he had given me a kidney and asked for nothing and let me walk away. I called Dahlia. She picked up immediately, which told me she already knew. There was a quality in her first hello that was braced. "You knew," I said. "Lolita? How long?" She was quiet. "Since before the surgery," she said. "He made me promise. He was very clear that he didn't want you to know. He was afraid you would refuse the transplant if you knew it was him." Pause. He was afraid I would refuse because he knew me, because he had been paying attention to me for a decade, and he knew that I was stubborn and proud and frightened, And he knew that if I found out my sworn enemy was offering me a kidney, I might refuse out of sheer defensive pride. And he had calculated all of that. And he had protected me from my own self-destructive instincts by ensuring I didn't know. He had loved me so carefully and so completely that he had even accounted for how I would get in my own way. Dahlia, I said. I know, she said. I love him. I know that too. I walked out. I figured. I sat on the bench with the phone against my cheek, and the river moving in front of me, and the afternoon turning gold and slow. And I felt something happening that I can only describe as the end of a very long winter. I went back. Not that day. I want to be honest. I am not going to tell you I heroically turned around immediately and ran back into the hospital and everything resolved cleanly. I went home that day. I sat with it for the rest of the afternoon and into the evening. I ate dinner. I watched the light change in my apartment. I thought about 10 years of choices and what they had been and what they could still be and what I wanted. But I went back. The next morning, I texted him first. Are you home? He replied after a moment. Yes, I'm coming over, if that's okay. He replied, yes. I had been to his apartment twice before, both times recently. Both times in the context of practicalities, dropping something off, picking something up. I knew the address. I took the bus, which gave me 30 minutes to sit with this specific feeling of moving towards something I had been moving away from for years. He opened the door before I knocked. He must have heard the elevator. He looked at me. He was wearing ordinary clothes, a gray sweater. Of course it was gray. He had always gravitated toward gray. I noticed this now with a specific tenderness. And he looked the way he always looked, except around the eyes where the careful management was thinner this morning, where the tiredness of someone who had been carrying something for a very long time was more visible. I stood in his doorway. I don't know how to do this, I said. I have never been good at this. You know that better than anyone. He said nothing. He waited. I have spent 10 years being wrong about you, I said. Or not wrong, exactly. I knew you were good at what you do. I always knew that. That was never the question. Wrong about what you were to me, what I was trying to do every time I competed with you, every time I pushed you away, every time I refused to let you in. I was trying to manage something I didn't know how to face. He was very still. And you. My voice caught. You gave me a kidney. You gave me a part of yourself, and you asked for nothing. You loved me so quietly, so completely, and without any demand. And I stopped. I looked at him. I'm sorry. For 10 years of not seeing you. For every time I chose pride over honesty, for walking out yesterday. I am genuinely, deeply sorry. He exhaled. Lolita, he said. He said my name the way he always said it, carefully and specifically, like it mattered. You don't owe me anything. That's not. I want you to understand that. I did not do what I did to create a debt between us. I did it because you love me, I said. He was quiet. You said it yesterday, I said. Don't take it back. Pause. The corner of his mouth moved. Just slightly. The way it did when something had genuinely reached him and he was trying not to show it. I had seen that expression 100 times and only now understood what it meant. I'm not taking it back, he said. Good, I said. Because I love you. I've been in love with you for I don't even know how long. Long enough that I don't know where the rivalry ends and the love begins. Maybe they were always the same thing. Maybe I was always just trying to keep you close in the only way I knew how. He looked at me for a long moment. Can I tell you something? He said. Yes. Junior year, February. You had a flat tire. Outside the East Library entrance. I stared at him. You remember that? I offered to walk with you, he said. You said no. I walked to my car, and I sat there for 20 minutes because I didn't want to drive past you on the street. I didn't want you to think I was watching you. He paused. I waited until I was sure you'd have enough of a head start. I thought about 19-year-old me standing in the cold, turning down a walk because I was too proud and too afraid. I thought about him sitting in his car in the dark, waiting so I wouldn't feel watched. That might be the most Rowena thing I have ever heard, I said. He looked at me, and then he laughed. It was quiet and real and unguarded, and it was the most beautiful sound I had heard in 10 years. I stepped into his apartment. He stepped back to let me in, and we stood in his hallway, and the morning light was coming through the window at the end of it, and the city was doing its ordinary city things outside. And inside his apartment, it was warm and quiet and finally true. "What do we do now?" I asked. He looked at me. "I think," he said, "we figure it out. Together. Without it being a competition." "That's going to require significant adjustment on my part." "I know," he said. "I'm prepared for that. You've always been annoyingly prepared. And you've always been annoyingly stubborn." "Is this going to work?" I asked. He looked at me, steadily, with that particular quality of attention I now recognized as one of the most defining features of who he was. The way he looked at things as they actually were, not as he wanted them to be. It was the same quality that had made him a brilliant journalist and a formidable adversary, and, I now understood, an extraordinary person to be loved by. "I don't know," he said, "but I've been waiting 10 years to find out. I want to tell you the rest in summary, because some things belong to the privacy of the actual living of them. But I want to tell you enough. We did figure it out. Not cleanly, not without friction. We were still ourselves, both opinionated and strong-willed, both carrying years of complex history that didn't dissolve because we had spoken the truth to each other. There were moments in those first months where old patterns surfaced, where competition and defensiveness moved through our dynamic like weather. We learned to name them when they appeared. We learned, slowly and with effort, to choose differently. Rolina was patient in a way that continued to humble me, not infinitely patient. He would tell me clearly when I was being unfair, and he expected the same honesty from me, but patient with the process, with the long and imperfect work of two people who had spent a decade misunderstanding each other, trying to understand each other instead. My health continued to improve. His kidney part of him inside me, was functioning with a compatibility that Dr. Fernandez called exceptional, which made me smile every time he said it in that carefully clinical way, because it felt like the word exceptional had always been applicable to Rowena, and it continued to be. We walked on Sundays. We still do. The river path, the bench where I sat in August and let the truth land, the bend where the trees lean over the water, and the light comes through in summer. The ordinary architecture of a life being built between two people who took a long way there. Sometimes, walking beside him, I think about all the years I spent holding him at arm's length, cataloging his professional shortcomings, choosing competition over connection, and I think about what those years could have been. And then I let that go. Because the present is enough, is more than enough, is everything. The present is him walking beside me in the early morning light, his hand finding mine without ceremony or announcement. The way things that are true settle into place. I have been asked, sometimes, by people who have heard pieces of this story, whether I think I can fully repay what he did. Whether the debt doesn't sit uncomfortably between us. Whether there's an imbalance that cannot be corrected. I understand the question, but I think it comes from a transactional understanding of love that Rowena has never shared, and that I have slowly, with his help, learned to let go of. He did not give me part of himself as a transaction. He did it as an act of love that expected nothing in return. Not repayment, not gratitude, not even knowledge. He did it in the purest possible way. The way that reveals more about a person's character than almost anything else could. You cannot repay that kind of love with an equal act. You can only try to love in kind, openly, honestly, without keeping score. That is what I am trying to do. I think it is enough. I think it is, in fact, everything. There's one more thing I want to tell you. A few months after we started, and I still don't have a precise word for when we started, because we had been moving toward each other for 10 years, and the start was somewhere in the middle of all of it. I came across one of my old notebooks from university, one of the journalism notebooks, the ones I filled during that first semester. I was looking through it for something else, and I found notes from a seminar, and in the margin of the notes, in my own handwriting from that first year, barely legible, RV Time notices things. That was all, just that. 19-year-old me, in the margin of a notebook, without understanding what she was writing, had recorded the essential truth of Rowena Velez. He notices things. He noticed me for 10 years with a consistency and care that I was too defended to receive. He noticed how I took my coffee and when I was tired and what I needed before I could ask for it. He noticed when I was afraid and gave me the space to come to him instead of pursuing me. He noticed when there was something he could do that would save my life, and he did it without making it about himself. I sat with that old notebook for a long time. Then I took a photograph of that margin note, and I sent it to him with no caption. He replied after a moment, just, I know. Of course he did. My name is Lolita Mayer, and this is the story of the person I spent a decade misunderstanding the year I almost didn't survive the kidney that keeps me alive, and the love I almost let pass me by because I was too afraid to see it for what it was. I am not the most graceful person in this story. I'm the person who walked out and came back, who took a decade to understand something that was always true, who had to lose almost everything before I was willing to be brave enough to stand in someone's doorway and say, I love you. I have been wrong. I am here now. Rolina was the person who showed up quietly, who gave without asking, who loved in a language I didn't have the vocabulary for until I nearly ran out of time to learn it. If there is something I want you to take from this, and I don't usually moralize, it's not my nature, but I've earned this particular observation. It's this: the people who love you well are not always the ones who announce it loudest. Sometimes the one who loves you most is the one who has been quietly paying attention for years, the one who knows how you take your coffee without being told, the one who waits by the elevator to open the door before you knock, the one who gives you the most irreplaceable thing they have to give and asks you not to know about it. Sometimes love is that quiet, that patient, that devastatingly, beautifully complete. And if you're lucky, if you're stubborn and afraid and slow and lucky, you find out in time. I found out in time. That is everything. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story. See you in the next one.